Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
And we've got a special guest for you today, someone who's been on the podcast a number of times because he's our fave.
Exactly.
That is Professor Ken Samples. And today we're talking about a book that we've been waiting for a long time. The one book that is amazing. Now, listen, I would tell you the title of this book, but we're just going to wait until the interview because right now we're actually re-recording our intro from like a week and a half ago. Chad, man, there's something going. We use Riverside to record our podcasts, and they have changed something. We're trying to get to the bottom of what's going on, but the audio just was crunching away. So I'm going to leave in Chad's. We're ditching our previous intro recording because it was so bad. It was so bad. But yeah, some of Chad's questions when he asks them, listener, just bear with it. It gets better later. But it's super crunch. It's like distorted and weird. So that's totally, we knew about that. We left it in because we're authentic.
Right. And just for my part, we have since taken steps to improve said audio. So that should not be a problem moving forward. And I think it was because I went into my Hulk Hogan impression and it just shook the very core of the audio. That's what it was.
What I was saying, I was telling Chad that, you know, this is a book on logic and critical thinking. And I said, this is the book I've been waiting for. And I said, you know, previously Travis Dickinson had this for his logic book. And now it's like there was this WWE wrestling belt that has been passed on to Ken Samples, and now he's the world record holder. And then Chad went into this like Hulkamania voice, and it was insane. And boy, I wanted to leave that in there, but I was afraid we would lose listeners because they would instantly hear this big crackling audio and like, rah! So, you know, if you pay our £600 a month Patreon fee, that's available. That's available for you to download, and there's also a signed poster of Chad with the belt. So
right,
anyway,
and check our store to see the Chad Sturve Disaster T-shirt. So
yes.
You know.
Yes. No, we really love this interview. We really love Ken Samples. We're really appreciative that he was on the podcast again, and we do really encourage you to, if you're looking for a good, really all around great book, and you know, I was really singing the praises of this book throughout the interview, so get ready for that if I don't edit it all out because I'm so embarrassed how like fanboying I was for this book. I really enjoyed it. So enjoyed this interview, and thanks for listening. Here we go.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
All right, well, Ken Samples, welcome back to the podcast yet again.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you guys. I follow your ministry, admire it, and I appreciate so much you having me on one more time.
Well, I was telling Chad that you've stolen the WWE belt for the best logic book. You know, before we thought it was, Travis Dickinson.
And that's a good one, by the way.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like a fine dish that has all the flavors just balanced right. His was delicious, but yours was a complete meal, 5-course, perfect. You cracked the code. Thank you for letting us, read this book and have a conversation surrounding the themes in it. So, and for the listener, it's called Clear Thinking in a Messy World, a Christian Guide to Logic, Reason, and Cognitive Bias. And we also have to thank Mark Perez, your co-author.
Yeah.
Certainly, you're both bringing out the best of one another. And we were just singing his praises. It was something that shifted my thinking in some things, so I appreciate it.
Well, we really appreciated your gracious endorsement, and I'm so happy that it is out. I've been thinking about this book for 40 years, so
Wow.
Thank you for those kind words. And it's such a pleasure when I know that it's helping people. That's the big thing.
Yeah, ever since I've known Brian, he's been looking
for the perfect book, and we're not even exaggerating. We were talking before you came on, and he's estimating about 15 years, but he's been looking for the perfect blend of like logic and Christianity, and he said in the introduction that this is the one. Like, this is finally the end of his quest.
These are kind words. I appreciate them very much.
But here's the reason, and we'll talk about what you think.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to hear what Ken thinks. I mean,
But here's the thing: you've got sort of a case for the Christian mind, and it lays a perfect foundation for that. And then it's like, okay, we could go really deep on logic. We could go really deep on critical thinking. We could really go really deep on cognitive biases. But the reader's going to get way bogged down. And what they really need is to be inspired to take this torch and run. And you've done that in all these three categories because each one gives you enough introduction, if you're a learner, like a novice, to be like, oh, yeah, I see where this path can lead me. And you've even given me some tools to go down that path. And all of these areas, if you only have the logic, but you don't have the understanding of the cognitive biases and where your thinking can go wrong, or you don't understand critical thinking and how to be maybe charitable and think about how to interact with ideas, you're going to make mistakes with all these tools. You need to know how they work together and how to balance them. And it's like, wow, you guys struck a great balance of that. And like, one of the things that inspired me was like, you've got something in there about learning and developing your mind. And it was like you were saying, just go, you can learn a language, you can read the great books and things. And you know what? I felt for so long like I can't read that. That's not productive to read that. I had a very utilitarian idea of what I'm reading. And I thought, you know what? It released me to read for enjoyment, for its intrinsic good. So it's been amazing to find the book, and I really appreciate it. But please tell me what is inspired you guys in how you put it together.
Well, thank you for all of that. I wanted the book to express our sense of the life of the mind to the glory of God. And there are lots of people who they love the Lord in many ways, but they need a little bit of encouragement and coaching on how to love God with their mind. I also wanted it to be more than just a logic text or a critical thinking text. I did want to inspire people, and I tried to use, as well as Mark, we both tried to use apologetic examples, so you get a little bit of invitation to Christian apologetics and Christian theology. So I definitely wanted to be a book that could be used in logic or critical thinking courses, but I wanted it to be more than that. I wanted it to be a book that you could go back to, that you could continue to kind of grow through. And I have to admit, I don't think that there's another logic text out there that has that addresses cognitive bias. So Mark Perez's part is a very important part. That's still a field that people are working through and developing. Yeah. So this was written for Christians, and Brian, I think the first time I taught logic was 1990, so it's 35 years in the working. And this book is in many ways kind of the book I wanted to have for my students through those years. And I've used a number of books, and there are some solid books out there. You mentioned Dickinson's book. I like that very much. I know him, and he is a gracious and thoughtful person. So this was kind of a book I was thinking all along about, and writing isn't an easy process, but I think what I really love about writing is afterwards talking about ideas with people who are interested. So your interview today is something that really makes it enjoyable to be an author.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I think is important kind of to start out with, because it's such, I feel like it's overlooked, is any book that I read that highlights the idea that Jesus was a logician. And how intelligent Jesus was is something that I think is incredibly valuable, because oddly, at least in my experience, it's rarely talked about in the church. And so can you talk a little bit about Jesus as a thinker, as a logician, so that listeners can kind of, who haven't thought about that maybe or been introduced to that idea, can begin to process it?
Yes. I've recently been reading again through the Gospels, and there are many things that impress me about Jesus. Obviously, the healing ministry is just something that just draws me in. And of course, I love all of the titles that he uses about himself. But I was very much struck by the fact that Jesus is not only a great storyteller, but he is a very fine teacher on the level, I think, with Socrates and Siddhartha Gautama and Confucius. He is a world-class storyteller. But then there is the sage logician, where Jesus, I mean, he's 12 years old, he's a carpenter, so he probably doesn't have the formal training that rabbis would receive. I have read that at the time of Christ, it was largely expected that a rabbi would pretty much have the Old Testament content down cold. And it was a oral tradition. So, you've got a lot going on with in terms of memory and things of that nature. But here's Jesus. He's 12 years old. He is talking with the elite religious leaders of Second Temple Judaism, and they're amazed by him. And it just struck me one day when I was reading Jesus's interaction with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the scribes. Jesus never draws an invalid inference. And that just hit me really hard, because I make mistakes in reasoning all the time. I have to go back and say, now, I don't think I got that right. Let me rework it. I mean, here Jesus has people coming to him, and their intention is to get him into serious trouble. They want to catch him on something, and should we pay taxes to Caesar? And he looks at them and says, well, give me one of those denarii. Whose image is on this? And they respond. He says, well, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and God the things that are God. And you can almost hear the silence. I think that is an incredible thing. Again, I've read a lot of the Socratic dialogues. I've read a good bit about Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, who was a fine teacher. I also admire Confucius as a teacher. And of course, Plato and Aristotle are two people that I think are some of the brightest in the history of Western civilization. I don't think any of them have anything on Jesus as a person who's capable of articulating ideas. So now you put that with the healings, you put that with the fulfillment of prophecy, you put that with Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. And I think that's one more powerful argument that he really was the Son of God. And, so when Jesus says, love God with your mind, that takes on a new element. Hey, here is a first-rate Christian thinker, a first-rate Messiah thinker. And I wanted people to get a touch of that, okay, maybe none of us are going to aspire to be an Aristotle or a Plato or a William Lane Craig or whomever it may be. But God has given us a gift of our mind, and we want to be able to use it, and we want that to express our love for the Lord. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Chad, because I think that's something a lot of Christians have not given some thought. And I owe that to a few different people. Certainly Dickinson brings that out, and I thought it was very, very helpful. A colleague of mine at Reasons to Believe George Haraxon, who is a philosopher, he emphasized that. And Dallas Willard is another that emphasized that. And I thought, wow, I really want something like that in the book.
Yeah, you mentioned Willard. I was thinking while you were talking, it brought to mind something I remembered him saying in a lecture. He said something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing. He said, if you don't believe Jesus is smart, then you're not going to go to him to learn how to live. And if you're not going to him to learn how to live, then how can you be his disciple? And that just hit me like a ton of bricks, like how important it is to not only see Jesus as holy, as healer, as all those things you talked about, but also you should see him as somebody who is intelligent.
That's exactly right. And it just kind of brings the Gospels on fire. You see all of these capacities, and it made me look again even at the parables. Wow, what stories these are. And immediately I thought, well, this is the reason I love Tolkien and Lewis. This ability to tell a story and draw people in. That part of that persuasion is, there's no doubt, Logos is very popular and very important, but you also have ethos and pathos that are involved in what Aristotle called that triangle of persuasion.
Yeah. So he was a master logician, but also a master rhetorician as
That's
well.
right.
One thing comes to my mind in thinking about the book is you've created a set of tools and a sort of a path to continue growing in the use of those tools of clear thinking, of helping us be discerning as Christians and as thinkers, and to love God with all our minds. So sometimes I get discouraged. Sometimes I'm excited when it comes to like things like AI and the resources and information we've got. So when I think about, anything I need to know, I can just Google it, or I can generate content or brainstorm with, Chat GPT or something like that. And at the same time, I'm like, oh, this is making me lazy. It making the world lazy, certainly, because now who's gonna like be the gatekeeper? Like, hey, why should I trust this? Because it came from AI. That somebody could change that. Like, so when I'm thinking about the value, one of the values of the book is like, right now you don't have to memorize facts anymore. It's almost can be a waste of time. You need to learn how to think and discern and to filter and to know where the information's going wrong, because there's so much information. It's easy to get the info. Now you have to be like, you have to figure out what you can trust.
Yeah.
What is something that is having so maybe you could talk a little bit about what it means to have discernment and how that can be developed.
Yeah, I think it's, when I give talks at churches about the life of the mind, about thinking carefully and critically, I try to take them from the word logic to that very word discernment. And so, John says, in the beginning was the word, and behind that is logos. And that is an incredible statement about Jesus being the life of God, the mind of God, the thoughts of God. And, in the New Testament, we're reminded how important it is to be discerning. John says, don't believe things too quickly. Many false prophets have gone out into the world. Paul says things like, put things to the test, hold on to the good. When I was growing up, I had a bug to learn. It never really kind of developed until a bit later. But I remember when I was in elementary and junior high school, and even in high school, if I wanted a lot of information, I had to go to the library. And I remember paying fines because I turned books in late because I wanted to read them. If I could compare that with my son, Michael, who is 27 years old, Michael was born right at the time in which the internet came into being. He has had access to information right at his fingertips. He can go all over the world. But the challenge that I had was getting access. I think the challenge that our children have is testing reliability. Is this good content? And I think a lot more discernment is needed now. Uh, it is easy to be influenced by indoctrination, propaganda. It's very easy for people to engage in deception. I mean, you have to at times now even wonder, well, is that really a photograph or is that AI? How do I know what it is? So I think we're at a stage where we do really have to fall back on ways of thinking carefully and discerning. And one thing we make in the point, and both Mark and I bring this out, and that is that logic doesn't teach you to think. The good Lord has given you a good mind and a good brain. And I know both of you, you're both very careful thinkers. What logic can do is to help you be careful because it's so easy to be lazy. It is so easy to be sloppy. And that's what I love about Aristotle's definition. He says logic is ordered thought. And that's what I need. I need my thinking to be ordered. I can't just take a vacation anytime I want. I need to be challenged. And Brian, I think you're right on the money with AI and with all of the technology that we now have and take it all for granted. We have to be able to have that mind that can really go through the material and weigh it and make a judgment.
So, Ken, you're saying that Mark Perez was doing more of the stuff in the area of the cognitive biases,
Right.
and maybe he was a higher contributor to that. But talk a little bit about this, because I've benefited a lot in the past from critical thinking books and more like logic books, informal logic books, and books about fallacies, and those are all really helpful in their own way.
Yeah.
But I haven't read as much, although I've heard like podcasts on cognitive biases, and I think these are just, it's like right up there with knowing all the logical fallacies, all the ways you could go wrong in the way you structure an argument. You can also don't realize you've got your own emotions, your own inclinations tricking you into like wanting something to be true or wanting a certain conclusion, or just having wrong slant to your own inclination to accept one argument over another or one conclusion over another. Talk a little bit about what these are and maybe a few examples that are ones that people might see commonly but maybe not recognize.
Yes, I completely agree. I think this is a kind of a new frontier. And again, I considered Mark's contribution to be so important to the book. Let's talk a little bit about this. A cognitive bias is that we have kind of at times an instinct or we have a predisposition towards something. So sometimes our instincts are correct, sometimes our intuition is correct, but there are many times it's not. And I've noticed for a long time that my students, when I would give them an assignment in ethics or in philosophy, world religions, or just in a critical thinking class, they would take a topic and I'd say, okay, make your case. But at the end of your paper, I want you to tell me what the best argument is on the other side and how you would respond to it. Well, we have what we call the confirmation bias.
Right.
It is very, very easy to start thinking where you're looking at evidence, you're looking at data, you're evaluating information, and there is this tendency, the shortcut, to take the shortcut and only look for evidence that supports your position. And that can get us into real trouble. Your argument is only as good as the evidence that supports it. And if you haven't looked at the evidence against your argument, you haven't looked at all the available data. So it's often the case, or I should say it's seldom the case, that an argument is just going to win the day and there isn't going to be any objection to it. There's not going to be any attempt to refute it. I think, having worked with many scientists over a period, you can almost find, no matter what topic it is in science, a scientist who's going to dispute it. And philosophy, it may even be more true, where somebody will stand up and say, no, I disagree with that. So confirmation bias, I mean, God has given us a gift to be able to detect information, to kind of abductively evaluate it and see how it works together. But we have to be very careful that we don't have kind of a privileged perspective where we think, I'm only going to look at the data that supports my theistic worldview, or I'm only going to look at the data that supports my view on abortion.
Mm.
And so confirmation bias lurks there. Now, if you add into that we are fallen people, we are both fallen people and we're finite people. Being finite, we have limitations and boundaries. Being fallen, we have certain prejudices and biases. And it is very easy to kind of fall into a trap. I think Paul quite clearly in Romans 1 says that one of the things that makes sin diabolical is it can blind you. And I know all of us have had that situation with our wives where they see our problem and we can't see it at all. And that happens all the time where there's this blind spot where we can't, make our way through. So confirmation bias is one that gets talked about a lot. It is very important. Another one is groupthink.
Hmm.
It is very easy, particularly on social media, where you go online and there's a group of people, and I have found that it's kind of easy to be sucked into that, where you're no longer thinking as an individual. You kind of fall into the groupthink. And again, you have to be very careful because even critical thinking scientists, critical thinking philosophers, historians, it's easy to fall into a groupthink and not kind of challenge fundamental ideas. So, if you give consideration that we are fallen, Christian thinkers for centuries have talked about the noetic effects of the fall. I think sometimes people exaggerate the negatives of that. I think there are other times maybe there isn't an appropriate appreciation of that. But you also give consideration that we don't remember things all the time. Your mind it's a powerful and amazing, but it can be tricky where you're certain that I saw these things. I was on the freeway a couple years ago and a truck hit a car and then the car hit me. And right afterwards, we all pulled over and got our phones out and exchanged information. Then the highway patrolman came on and he said, well, were you rolling when you were hit or had you come to a stop? And I was sure, no, I'm sure I was rolling. But then later, I realized I wasn't rolling. I know I had stopped and I looked in the rearview mirror hoping she wouldn't hit me.
Mm.
Your mind, I had a lot going on at that time. It was a tricky circumstance. So that amazing memory that God gives us, it can play tricks with us. And I think being aware of these basic cognitive biases is very, very helpful and meaningful. So that if you look at the messy world we've talked about, you've got informal fallacies, you've got indoctrination, you've got propaganda, you've got conspiracy theories, and now you've got cognitive biases within yourself that you have to work through. So I think what's very helpful, and it's something I've believed in for a very long time, and that is that you need to constantly go back to these things, need to be reviewing these kinds of things. And the dangers that we make is, when I'm tired, I want to take a weekend off. Our mind is always wanting to take a weekend off.
Mm.
And we have to drive it back there and say, nope, you need to work a little harder here.
You say a couple of times in the book, makes me chuckle, where you're like, yeah, your mind always wants to have a weekend, and it only does the minimum amount of work. We're not just lazy and want to sit on the couch, but our brains want to just chill out and not do the hard thinking. But you have to realize you could go off the rails so easily. So that was one mental note. I was like, and the note I took in my mind was, be careful, be careful, be careful. That was the note, is like, you have to be a careful thinker, because of just like a minefield you're describing, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Ken, my mind's kind of reeling here in like 2 or 3 directions I want to go of
Sure.
notes I took while I was reading. So I'm just going to ask, and this kind of piggybacks on what you were saying. There's kind of this prevailing idea, particularly I see it on social media, that somehow, science gives us objectivity. It's implied that science is almost this cold, almost gives us almost cold mathematical certainty. Now, of course, like scientists would deny that, but in practice, they sometimes act like that, particularly skeptics. Whereas like philosophy, religion, those things are kind of shunned, or people kind of look down their nose, and it's almost like, well, that's subjectivity, or, philosophers, they just sit around and talk about things and never accomplish anything, kind of paraphrasing Lawrence Krauss. So, I guess what I'm asking is how would you respond to that idea that somehow science is the beacon of objectivity, and all other disciplines must kind of bow the knee to that?
I've heard that a great deal. What I find very interesting is that there are many scientists. Some of them are really fine scientists, outstanding in their field. They're outspoken, and a lot of times they're reflecting a secular worldview. And Chad, they don't know how science works. They say things. Lawrence Krauss says the arbiter of all truth is experiment. And I'm like, well,
Wow.
did that come out of an experiment?
Yeah.
I have scientists all the time say, philosophy, history, religion. Yeah, you guys, that's all kind of, it involves a certain amount of wishful thinking. And they don't realize that science depends upon assumptions, that undergirding science is a cluster of unscientific beliefs, like there's a real world out there. You can trust your cognitive faculties and sensory organs, logic and math work. All of these kind of things are underneath it. Mortimer Adler, one of the great educators and philosophers of the 20th century, he made the comment in his book, How to Read a Book. He said, scientists are highly specialized, but not necessarily well educated. And I don't think he was poking fun or attacking, because that has been my experience. When I talk to my colleagues at Reasons to Believe, their education is so chocked full of science and data that there is very little information given about the philosophy of science, the history of science. Many scientists are surprised when they hear that theism played a very significant role, Christianity in particular, with the birth of science. And again, these assumptions, I've had people say to me, well, science just works. And I say, how does it work? I debated a scientist, it was up in Fresno, and the scientist said, as a scientist, I have no beliefs. So I waited till my turn, and I just chalked off all of the beliefs that he had as a scientist. So science is a remarkable way of knowing, but it's very limited. And it needs to be co-joined with philosophy, with theology in various fields. And it's interesting to me that people who gravitate toward science and away from theism, they kind of want to pit science against Christianity. And I say that's a strange thing, because historically, Christianity birthed science, and the intellectual assumptions that go with science are deeply compatible with theism. So it's also unfortunate when very good scientists start talking philosophy, and you begin to realize, wow, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yes.
So we all have limitations. We all have boundaries. We all need to be counterchecked. And I think this kind of popular scientism has been adopted by people, but we need to challenge it. We need to show them that, look, you're never going to have an experiment that's going to tell you that experimentation is the only way you can know the truth.
Mm.
That's an assumption according to your worldview.
Yeah. And one of the things too about that is the idea that, and you bring this out in the book, I think beautifully, is the idea that regardless of what you're doing, whether it's theology, philosophy, science, whatever discipline you're in, these principles, the formal, the informal, logical fallacies, being aware of your biases, and all of those things are going to help you be more objective, regardless of what field that you're working in. And so I think that's a great thing that's brought out in the book subtly.
Well, I had one scientist say to me, I don't need to study logic. I studied calculus. And I said, well, I respect your knowledge of calculus, but calculus is not the formal study of logic. I said, logic is going to present things to you that even calculus will not. And so we do need that challenge. And if I could reverse it for a moment, my science colleagues have helped me a great deal. They've helped me think about things like quantum mechanics. They've helped me think about things like, what is a cosmic singularity and what is inflation? And so I don't ever want to convey the idea that they're learning just from me. I've learned so many different things from them. And it's just interesting that science involves such specialization. I mean, I've been in a room with 6 different types of physicists, and they're all specialized in the different field. And I'm thinking, I love specialization, but we also need a breadth of education where we draw from that kind of liberal arts, that kind of classical liberal education, if you will.
Yeah, I love that.
Ken, just to let you know, on my Ken Samples bingo card, I just got covered one up when you said Mortimer Adler.
So, wouldn't you put Tolkien and Lewis on that card too?
No, well, other people say that, but Ken Samples is like the one who you're always going to mention Mortimer Adler. And
that's a pretty safe prediction. That's a safe prediction.
And rightly so. It's such great stuff that he's Adler and how to read a book and how to speak, how to listen.
Yeah.
Right. So Chad's talking about logic being a force multiplier, basically. And that's like, that's why, the logic and the critical thinking, just to piggyback, as Chad's bingo card is saying the word piggyback.
That's true. So, it's, why? Because in elementary school, it's like teachers that they say that all the time. Let me piggyback on that. Let me piggyback on that. So that's where I picked that up at. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I've been trained.
So that's, as you're saying, it just seems to me you guys are both describing this idea of like logic and critical thinking. It's not like, oh, this is better than other stuff. This is just something that makes you less likely to make mistakes in whatever area you're in, and it's going to help you think clearer and do better work in whatever area. So it's a force multiplier in that regard. It doesn't matter what you're doing. You could be an artist and a writer or whatever, and it's going to help you. One thing that you seem to be to my mind a model of many things, and so we love you so much for being a guest again in that regard and all your contributions. But one of the things is this idea of a principle of charity. You mentioned just a moment ago where, oh, by the way, they've taught me so much, and I'm like, oh, see, there it is. This is this principle of charity where you're always so gracious, and appreciate that.
Well, if I could interrupt real quick too, Brian,
yeah.
I would say that too. I picked that up did you notice when he was talking about, when he was comparing Jesus to other thinkers? Sometimes when you have that comparison, a lot of times you almost, the way that people talk about other ancient thinkers, it almost degrades them a bit. Whereas Ken went out of his way to say, this person was very good at this. I thought this person was very good at this. And this person was very good at this. It's just that Jesus is, the superior, so even there I picked up on it. Yeah.
So the reason I go there is because I wanted to talk about logical fallacies, something that I think can be really fun, but also someone who's new to them can run around, and you acknowledge it in the book, where they can run around and be like, yay, I'm going to There's one, and you become like the fallacy police, and then you probably haven't learned yet. It's just really like,
Yeah.
oh, these are everywhere, So talk a little bit about your approach to logical fallacies, and maybe how in the course of learning about them, we need to be charitable and things like that.
One of the reasons that I wrote this book was years ago teaching Introduction to Logic to students, and it was at a community college. So these were not students who necessarily had all of their ducks in a row. They were, they were trying to take introductory courses to maybe transfer to a university or get involved in some type of employment. And I had a collection of these students who, after the semester, they came to me and they said, Professor Samples, logic has done something different for me that other classes have not done. They said, I feel empowered. For the first time, I know what an argument is. And I even know how arguments often break down into fallacies. And I even know the Latin for this name and that name. And they thought, and they expressed the idea that, wow, I never knew that education could do that. And that's something that really turned me on. I wanted to help students to develop skills that would help them discern truth, build confidence. They didn't have to be MIT students or students going on to elite universities. They could be everyday persons. And so that was important to me. Of course, what happens when I start teaching them fallacies, and I would give them a test and they would have to pick out. And of course, initially they thought everything's a fallacy. And I said, no, you need to pull that back in. Not everything is a fallacy. So you want to look at it very carefully. And then they would kind of get to the position where they would want to poke a person in the eye with the fallacy, and I told them, look, I don't go home at night after class and identify my wife's fallacies. I'm much smarter than that, much more discerning than that. I'm very careful about what I say to Mrs. Samples.
Did you learn that from a book or from direct experience?
It was probably a little bit of both.
Yeah. Or you don't read Greg Kokel's Tactics and then go home and Columbo your wife.
That's right.
Right. Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt, but yeah.
That's exactly right. And I would say, now look, we want, as a Christian, I love truth and I'm willing to fight for the truth. I'm willing to stand up for the truth, but I care a great deal about unity. And I care about charity. And I remember, reading through 1 Corinthians 13, and there were times where I thought, wow, can my life be evaluated in terms of what kind of loving influence has it had? So I think it's very important to be able to recognize that these are skills to be learned. They're tools in your toolbox, but our goal is to persuade people, and people are persuaded, first of all, and I think Aristotle is right here. He talks about ethos, which is a character persuasion. He then talks about pathos, where we get words like empathy and sympathy, connecting to the emotion, and then finally logos. It's fascinating. Aristotle doesn't mention logic until third. So that really struck me, that if we want to be able to persuade people, if we want to be able to communicate the Christian worldview, and that is, I can vigorously disagree with you and still value you and still respect you. And we can develop a friendship, even if we, at the end of the day, come away disagreeing with one another. And to me, I came away from apologetic experiences that were characterized by smack talk and sarcasm and ridicule. I just did not find that to be personally fulfilling. And I didn't think other people did all that well either. And, I was trained by Walter Martin, and boy, Walter Martin was an amazing apologist. But I had to realize that I'm not Walter Martin. I don't have the same skill set, the same personality, and I needed to be Ken Samples. And for me, when I talk with Christians, truth, unity, and charity. I'm happy to talk with Catholics about the differences I have, or Orthodox. But I also want to talk about unity. And I also want to be able to communicate that these ideas are not just ideas. They're ideas that shape our lives. And so, Paul talks a lot about love. And at the end of the day, I think I would be a failure, even if I mastered logic and critical thinking and history and philosophy and science, if I were a jerk, if I were insensitive, intrusive, and majored in sarcasm and ridicule, Brian, I think a good part of my life would have been a failure. And the reality is we're all in the biggest room of the world, the room for improvement. And I try to see myself as part of that. And I'm sure there are people who think at times, I wish Ken were a little more challenging or a little more confrontive about issues. And there may have been times maybe I should have been, but I don't think sarcasm and ridicule necessarily get you very far in the conversation.
Yeah, and that's so important because I'm thinking right now in our current culture, I think more than ever with the onset of social media, it's so tempting to, throw out 140 characters of a quippy comeback, and it's also easier to do it when you're hiding behind a keyboard versus, face to face. And so I think what you're saying is super important. I love what you said about when you learn logical fallacies. For some reason, what came to mind was in the first Karate Kid film, Johnny Lawrence, right? He's trained by the very aggressive, obnoxious sensei, and he's not taught any kind of restraint. So he just goes out and beats people up. Whereas Daniel, trained by Mr. Miyagi, understands the power of what he's being taught and the proper use of it. And so I think, unfortunately, sometimes people do kind of go Johnny Lawrence with the logical fallacies, right? They kind of come out and, they're calling them out on their friends and their wives and their family members and social media. And it gets to the point where it's like, oh, man, take a break, So yeah, I think that's a great point of using restraint.
As I have studied some of the great educators, what I have been aware of is that a very central part of education is not just knowing, it is developing character, developing the kind of person that you are. And I think that that's just very, very important. And, I love your allusion there, because that's exactly right. I wanted students to be able to feel like I can go to Professor Samples, he will help me. He will correct me, but he'll never embarrass me. He will want me to continue to grow. And so, I think that moral character is an important element.
Well, let me shift gears slightly, and I'm going to go off script from the book specifically. Although I'll use the diving board of something in the book, and in the second chapter, I don't see it in my head, but you talk about a list of great books and things where, you could develop your mind. I want to know, what is Ken Samples on his list for books that you would maybe go back and read every year? Do you have anything that you go back and you're like, hey, you know what? I don't need to read this once. I need to read this over and over on like a cycle rotation here, because I'm really interested in what books would be on that list for you.
Yeah, I would define a great book as a book that you can never fully exhaust. It's a book you can never fully own. And thus it's a book you can read it when you're 20. And what you would get from it at 30 and 40 and 50 may be very different. And of course, the best example of that is Scripture. Scripture is the greatest of the great books. It obviously has inspiration in the Holy Spirit. But, you know, in 1978, the first Christian book I ever read was Mere Christianity. I've since read it, I think, about 15 times. And every time I read it, it still challenges me. It convicts me. It shows me my sin. It teaches me a little more about the Trinity that I didn't know. And so I have gone back to it. And I've had students say, Ken, why would you read Mere Christianity 15 times? Couldn't you be reading other books? I said, well, C.S. Lewis is this individual who can take substantive issues and make them accessible. And I know how he did that. In World War II, he was trying to encourage the war effort. He would go to the RAF bases and talk to these young men, and many of them weren't coming home. I mean, the casualty rate among the airmen is just sky high. Sorry for the pun. But Lewis began going out, and he realized, you know, these are just common everyday young men. They're not Oxford, Cambridge types. So he said, I need to think about how can I communicate my ideas in what he called uneducated words. And Lewis is a master at that. And so the last time I read it, I thought about, he made me think about the Trinity anew. He made me think about morality, and he motivated me to want to go and read other books by him. St. Augustine is, of course, a great example of this. I remember R.C. Sproul saying in a comedic way, he said, if you've been a Christian for more than 2 years and if you haven't read St. Augustine's Confessions, you're sinning. And I love that. I have read the Confessions probably 20 times. I don't know. The last time I read it, I decided I'm gonna have my pencil and paper, and I'm gonna note every time Augustine cites Scripture or alludes to Scripture, and it was 600 times. 600 times. People like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, they largely had the Bible down. And these were unique individuals. And I share with people, I say, look, you know, Augustine wasn't an apostolic author, and nor was Aquinas, nor was Athanasius or Anselm. But these were shapers of orthodoxy. That is, they took the biblical data, they articulated the Trinity, they defended it, they shaped it. And it's very important fundamentally to be a student of the Bible, but don't downgrade these other individuals in light of Scripture. They were the ones who had to respond to Arianism and respond to Pelagianism. So I love the Confessions. That would be another book that I return to frequently. And in large measure because I'm always learning from Augustine. But I often, when I read that book, I think of myself. Because I think Augustine was so forward thinking that he wasn't just writing about himself, he was writing about humanity's pursuit of God. And I see me in there, and that kind of draws me in. Others, every Christmas I try to return to On the Incarnation, which I think is a masterpiece of theology. There's even an edition you can get where Lewis writes the introduction, and it's terrific. So these are some of the books I return to. Let me mention one more, Blaise Pascal's Pensées. I don't know how to compliment Pascal. He was a great physicist. He was a logician, developed probability theory. He was a mathematician. He was an experimental scientist. developed a calculating machine in the 1700s. When Peter Kraft is a Catholic philosopher I like very much, very broadly educated, and Kraft said the other day, he said, my favorite philosopher is Pascal. And I thought, wow, Kraft knows a lot, and he has dug into the Pensées. So those are a few, Brian, that, I feel connected to them. I feel like when they write, I can identify myself in their writings. I feel like they're friends. They're part of the kingdom of God. They're part of the church. And it's not always easy to find people in the church who enjoy the same things I do. And so when I read them, I feel like I'm being encouraged by them.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned something you said there right at the end leads perfectly into what I wanted to ask about. You mentioned how it's not always easy to find people in the church that are interested in the things that you're interested in. And of course, that's in the context of kind of the intellectual life, right? But one of the themes that you touch on near the beginning of the book, I can't remember offhand what the chapter was, but the idea, the church is a school, right?
Yeah.
And the church shouldn't just be a school, but it should at least be a school, right?
Yes.
So I think a lot of Christians that I've talked to don't experience that in their churches. And again, this isn't like beat up on the church, because I think it's better than it used to be honest. So I do want to highlight that. But if someone's listening or they're thinking, I kind of feel what Ken said there, that, I feel alone a bit in this regard, and I'd like to see my church become a bit more of a school, if you will. What would be some kind of practical steps you'd give them to move in that direction, other than beginning to educate themselves, of course, but beyond that?
Yeah, I love the Pelican quote. The church is always more than a school, but it cannot be less than a school.
I knew I read that. That was in the book, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't want anybody to think I thought of that. No way.
I'm sorry. I outed you there.
No, I'm glad you did, because I was pretty sure I read it in the book, but then my mind's like, was it in the book or did I read that somewhere else? But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
It's I appreciate your comment though, Chad. I visit lots of churches, and they don't do things exactly necessarily the way I would. I have attended the Catholic Church in my life. I've attended a Lutheran, Reformed, and Presbyterian, and now I attend an Anglican church. And so, I don't want to be negative and criticizing what I see people do. I want to draw them in. I want to help them. I want to build on what they're doing well.
Yes.
And there are a lot of lovely Christian people who are very sincere in the way that they are living their life for Christ. But we do have intellectual people, and it is easy to feel kind of out of place. If you want to talk about issues of science or philosophy or history, and a lot of times people, they're not used to that kind of thing. I offer some recommendations. One recommendation is to start a book club. You can maybe locate people in your church that hold similar views and say, hey, what if we took one book, doesn't necessarily have to be a classic book, but we might want to move in that direction, where you could read it and you could have a leader who would interact and talk about those kinds of things. So you're building a little bit of community. You realize you're not really just the only person. I also encourage pastors to, from the pulpit, acknowledge that that learning is important, that loving God with your mind is important, that we need intellectual people. There are lots of young people leaving the church. Part of bringing those people back and keeping them in the church I think is exposing them to thoughtful people who can help them grow. So it's kind of ironic that we're losing people out of the church, but it's the people that can help them that are sometimes isolated.
Hmm.
And I say, why couldn't we bring people into the church? Bring a scientist in, bring a philosopher, a historian, bring a literary scholar in, and have that as part of the outreach. We talk about children's ministry, we talk about marriage. Why don't we talk about the people who are intellectuals? How do we navigate that area? And I think a lot of times the churches are kind of oblivious to that. And I wrote an article a number of years ago about trying to find your place in an evangelical church. And it just blew up on social media. People were coming out and saying, "Oh, it's exactly my experience. I feel kind of alone in that kind of context." But Chad and Brian, there are a lot of people that may not be able to appreciate how important learning is, how significant it is. It's not the be all, it's not everything, but for me to be around the two of you and talk about ideas and talk about a book I've written, I find that so enjoyable. I find it so encouraging. I'm interacting with people who care about things that I care about. So I'm always trying to convey to people, pastors, that look, there is a area of the ministry that's ignored, and it's often the intellectual people. And you want to be able to bring things up with them and not feel intimidated. Some pastors feel intimidated when they have thinkers come into their church, but I think if they can be humble, they can begin to make some changes in the church that can really help individuals. And what's interesting, it seems like there's a new appeal to book clubs. Almost everywhere I go, people are reading books and they're having book clubs, and that's their kind of social connection with each other. And I say, amen. I love that kind of thing. I can't imagine, sitting around drinking tea or coffee, having a snack, and talking with people about a great book you've been reading.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I got another question, and this is another off the off the beaten path. But all right, I asked this question because you're into the life of the mind and lifelong learning. So let's say someone says, "Hey, I really want to master a particular topic. I have a good understanding of a particular topic," or they're engaging with a book or something like that. They're like, "Hey, what's the best way for me to really absorb this, to train myself to see this from all angles?" If you're approaching a new topic, Ken, how do you think about that in your head?
Yeah, many years ago, I began to see how important it was for me and others to think in a worldview fashion. And so I approached the group at RTB and I said, "Look, I think I'd like to write a book about worldviews. I think that this is very important. We can't know everything about what other people believe, but we can develop the Christian worldview. We can compare it and contrast it with competing worldviews. And I can expose people to the fundamentals of worldview thinking, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, logic, etc." And I began thinking to myself, okay, how can I pull in people who are evangelicals, who don't have a deep background? How can I write about substantive issues? Because if you don't address substantive issues, then very thoughtful, reflective people will say, "That's not what I need." But if you don't make it accessible, you'll have very limited areas. And I have always taught a Bible class, and I would frequently have very thoughtful, well-educated people in my class with graduate degrees, but I would also have young men and women who would be coming in. They were uh, they were now out of the Sunday school phase and they were into something deeper. So I would be asking myself, how can I address these topics in a way that um, I can raise the substantive issues, but I can also make them as accessible as I can. Again, this is that C.S. Lewis element. So I started thinking about worldviews. I began asking myself, okay, um, I need to come up with a list of the critical worldview books, and I need to think about that not just Christianly. I need to think about worldview because worldview thinking also involves um, other. It's very much built upon philosophy. So I needed to think about the topic of worldview philosophically, theologically. Then I began making a collection of books, reading through them, and I began asking myself, is there something that I can contribute? Not just not just a repeat of all of these things. Is there something that I can add that I think can improve, can help make a contribution? And again, I often think of that idea that if I can say something simply, not simplistically, if I can say something clearly. I love the word clear, and I'm glad it got in as the title
Hmm.
because clarity has a force all its own. When you present an argument with crystal clarity, it just has an impact on people. So I think, Brian, the way of going about something like that is you're going to have to expose yourself to the good literature. You're going to have to do a series of checks to see what kind of literature comes down. I think you also need to think very seriously about what is going to be the focus, what is going to be the contribution of a book like that. Let's say you were going to write it, but if you were just going to be developing, I think you would do something very similar to that. Um, I'm often looking for people who are well educated on a given topic, but yet are people that have uh, they have a respect for ideas. I stay away from people that they're always wanting to they're always wanting to criticize. I want to say, okay, I know what you're against, but what are you for? Tell me what you're for in that kind of context. So I will go to basic books that kind of just introduce ideas to me. And then I would ask myself, if somebody were to ask me, what are the better books on the topic? What are the major categories of that field? And how would a Christian approach those kinds of things? So those are some of the things that I work on. Like right now, I'm working on a new book, and there's going to be a few topics in the book I've never addressed before. So I'm already thinking, okay, I want to expose myself to the best material. Uh, One topic is the hiddenness of God that I'm planning to address. So I'm exposing myself to differing points of view. I'm reading Schellenberg, but I'm also reading other people who kind of come at it from different points of view.
A lot of good insights there. So one more question before we start to wrap up, Ken, and that is like, I like how your book is formatted in a way where, from my perspective, it's really well balanced, but at the end of every chapter, there's sort of a summary, sort of questions. You'd mentioned having a book club. This might be one that people could work through, or you could use it in a class or something if you were teaching, because there are sort of the structure is there to guide you in your own review, in your own sort of study, but also it could be helping to facilitate classes and things like that. Would you envision someone utilizing this book in the best way to sort of develop for themselves or use in classes and things?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, I certainly think that this is a book that could be used in a number of logic courses. It may be an introduction to logic. Sometimes you have intro to logic and critical thinking. There are other times where you might look at logic and worldview. And so I think that this book, and again, Mark's very valuable contribution in the last third of the book with cognitive biases, it could work in all of those areas. But we also thought very carefully, we didn't want this book to be pigeonholed as a textbook. We wanted it to be a book that people could pick up, that Christians could pick up. And again, a lot of times I recommend books to people and they will read 25% of the book and then they'll stop. And they have a collection of books higher than the table that where they've, right about 25%, they slow down and they ask me, Ken, am I just a bad guy? Have I got a bad brain? And I say, no. It's good to read books that are over your head. It's good to read books that are challenging you. You need that. I think our book is a book that can continue to challenge you over a period of time. Maybe you've got the fallacies down. That would be great. Now think about, how can I address propaganda, education, indoctrination, or maybe you want to look again at cognitive biases. So it can be used in that way. But it's also a book, and I try to encourage people in this context, Brian. A lot of times people do not pre-read, what we call skimming. You can't read every single book you want with the limited number of years you have. You need to be thinking about, how much time am I going to devote myself to the very best books? So skimming, you could even skim Clear Thinking in a Messy World. You'll notice that there are very clear 3 parts. We have summaries. We define key terms. I have a number of tables that you can look at. I have written it as a book that could be used by a teacher who says, hey, look, I'm going to assign this, but I'm going to assign sections 1 and 3. But I think that I wrote this book hoping that any Christian could pick it up. And even if it felt a little bit heavy at first, they could make their way through. And certainly when you read about Jesus right at the beginning, that kind of helps you see that, hey, our Lord cared about thinking and reasoning, and maybe you can make your way through various parts of it. So I am just very pleased by it. A couple years ago, I had a health series of events, and it was pretty serious. I had to take 3 months off work, and it was a really tough time. And I remember thinking, I said, Lord, what's going to happen to my logic book? If I can't recover from all this and get back on the track. And the Lord, through good medicine and prayer and all these wonderful things, I was able to retain my health. And Mark and I were able to see it through to the end. And so I'm asking the Lord to bless it, because he tends to do that when I go through tough times. It always seems like his grace is more than enough.
Wonderful.
Well, yeah, I just want to say before we wrap up, a lot of times when I've read books that do address logic and fallacies and things like that, when it gets to that section of the book, sometimes those sections can get very bogged down and feel very like dry and textbooky. This treatment in this book of those topics was easily the clearest and the best I've read, in the sense that there's an explanation, whether, let's say we're talking about a fallacy. Okay, here's an explanation. Here are some examples. I love how you used examples that were both Christian, non-Christian, from the left, from the right, illustrating what you're trying to get people to do, right? Which I loved. And then, some possible like pitfalls or things to watch out for when you're assessing it. And I loved how it was long enough for me to understand it, but it wasn't so long that I felt like, okay, this is getting very dry. This is getting, so I thought that was just excellent. And then secondly, while I have you on here, I wanted to make sure that I just personally thank you for not only your intellectual example, but also just your example in the way that you live your life. And I was telling Brian that, if we could multiply, and have more thinkers, Christian thinkers out there like you, you would probably be the one that I would multiply. So just thank you for your example and just for all that you do.
Well, I have real appreciation for both of you. You guys are bright and you're thoughtful and you're fun to be with. I just write books so I can get back on your show.
Great.
All right. Well, we'll keep inviting you then. All right. Well, because we love your books.
I just want to remind the readers of Ken's list here of the books that you should read once a year. The Bible, Mere Christianity, Confessions by St. Augustine, On the Incarnation by Athanasius, Pensée maybe, and then, of course, Clear Thinking in a Messed Up World.
Exactly.
So I just use that as a lead-in to remind people of the book. But yeah, a lot of great books and worldview books as well. So we'll point all our listeners to those things. Thank you so much, Ken, for joining us for yet another great conversation, and look forward to the next one.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.